Did the LA Clippers jinx themselves? This is a really weird topic, right? Not something I thought I would be talking about, but there was a lot of weird circumstances around the end of the regular season as we now approach the playoffs. I don't ever recall a situation like this where there were teams actively, I guess you could call it tanking, positioning themselves in a way that would allow them to be on the side of the playoff bracket that they wanted to be. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. And there's a lot of context to this that we'll get into in this video. But essentially, we're going to be talking specifically about the Clippers and if it was a mistake for them to treat the end of the regular season the way that they did. Quickly, before we get started, I like to remind people this is the most consistent NBA content on YouTube that you're going to find. I upload every single day on this channel. It's a great place for consistent NBA content. So if you're interested in that, then consider subscribing. You can leave a like rating on the video as well. And check me out at various socials and a Linktree link down in the description below. With those things said, let's talk about the Clippers. So it wasn't just them. Let's just make that clear. There were a handful of different teams that were trying to put themselves in the best position possible in the postseason, specifically as it related to not having to play the LA Lakers early or at all in the NBA playoffs. Here was the idea, the mindset. The assumption was that the Lakers were probably going to be the 7th seed, assuming they won their play-in game, which they ended up winning. They obviously didn't know that at the time that they were trying to lose these games. But the point was they didn't want to be on the same side of the bracket as the Lakers. The Clippers specifically, as well as a handful of other teams, if they had a choice, they would rather not face the Lakers until the conference finals. So they ended up trying to lose different games or position themselves in a particular way to where they wouldn't have to play arguably the toughest 7 seed in NBA history. That mindset makes complete sense, and from a lot of different perspectives, that's actually a really intelligent way to look at things, because you can say what you want from a competitive standpoint, but you would like to have the easiest route to the finals as possible, and that does not include having to play the Lakers early. Just ask the Phoenix Suns, ask Suns fan. This is not the matchup that they now want, to play the Lakers in the first round. Specifically as it relates to the Clippers, however, the question is coming up, is this a big mistake for them? Have they jinxed themselves? Is this something that they should have pursued, either overall just for themselves or just in terms of some kind of mojo? So let's get to the first part. This is absolutely an awful idea if you're the Clippers. It's specifically because of who you are as a franchise. You are the little brother in LA. You talked about when you brought in Kawhi, when you brought in PG, that it was going to be this battle of LA and you were going to directly compete with the Lakers. And then now you're turning around and actively avoiding them. And that to me tells me two things. One, you never really meant it. This mindset that was ridiculous at the time, by the way, that you were going to somehow take over basketball in LA when the Lakers are arguably the most prestigious franchise in professional sports history, at least in the States. The idea that you were going to somehow take over the city from them was ridiculous. But then the other part of this, that you're supposed to be directly competing from them, is clearly out the window because it shouldn't matter. Do you think the Lakers would have actively avoided the Clippers in the first round if the situation was reversed and they were trying to figure out which seed they were going to be and the Clippers were going to be the 7th seed? Do you think the Lakers would have been afraid? Do you think the Lakers would have looked at that matchup and said, you know what, I'd rather not play those guys. Let's give somebody else a crack at them? Absolutely not. Even when you consider the fact that LeBron is going to do anything he can to try and position himself best from a narrative perspective and all these different ways. If any superstar ever was going to do something like that, it would be LeBron. And they definitely wouldn't have done this. And it just speaks to a level of confidence that just doesn't exist within the Clippers organization as it relates directly to the Lakers, but specifically to this team. This sends all kinds of the wrong message to me. Maybe you could make the case that I'm overreacting, but there's no more obvious example of this than the Lakers Clippers. This is classic little brother syndrome where you don't want to go against the guy in the team that you feel like owns you, because they do. Historically, these particular rosters have never matched up in the conference finals because the Clippers choked that away last year. But when you bring into account the playoff failures from last year, you can account for the bubble however you want to, the playoff struggles of Paul George in the past, playoff P, whatever the case may be, and then also actively avoiding the team that everybody kind of believes at this point should be the favorites to come out of the West, is just all kinds of bad vibes for me. Now, from an intelligence standpoint, is it smart to do this? Maybe. Maybe you could make the case that if you want to give every other team a crack at LA before you get to them, maybe wear them down a little bit, or potentially just not have to face them at all. Maybe you feel like it's a bad matchup for you. Maybe you feel like you would rather Utah or somebody try and have to take out the Lakers because you quite frankly feel like they have better personnel to do so, but then you match up conversely better with Utah than you do with LA. And logistically, like, I see how you could build that argument. But the other side of that is, and we talked about this in the Suns video the other day, this is a beat up Lakers team. You know, even though they did play well in the play-in game and they ended up beating the Warriors and they're now in the postseason, LeBron is not fully recovered from an ankle injury. We think Anthony Davis is fully recovered from his injuries, but he played less than half the season. Couldn't you make the argument that you'd rather play them as soon as possible and you'd rather get the 2 seed? You'd rather not lose to the Thunder and Rockets in the span of a week and somehow tank your way to the 4th seed, which again is just so bizarre. I can't recall this ever happening ever before. Couldn't you make the argument that you would rather play the Lakers when they're beat up, when they have barely played together? This is a roster that has barely played with its full complement of options in the last couple of months specifically. And yes, they were 21-6 or whatever through their first nearly 30 games, and they're clearly a very talented team. But guess what, LA? Every team in the West is really, really good unless you get the 1 seed and you're playing either Golden State or at this point Memphis, and at the time it could have been San Antonio as well. Everybody else is really, really good. Even Denver, without Jamal Murray, is a very good basketball team. Portland and Dallas are going to be able to score the ball extremely well, and this mindset of trying to avoid a particular team makes no sense to me, because you're basically admitting that you don't feel like you can beat them. If you feel like you can beat everybody, then there's no reason to be afraid, and it just adds to this feeling around the Clippers that they're trying to do too much. They're trying to compensate for something, right? And they're trying to actively avoid who should be the team that you should be going after. You should be fully confident, quite frankly, in this postseason as a whole, and specifically against the Lakers. The Clippers have had a great season. They've been a little bit up and down at times, and some guys have missed some games. But overall, you could make the case when you look at the entirety of the Western Conference that this should be the Clippers' year to make it to the finals. The Jazz and the Suns have had fantastic seasons. I like both of those teams a lot. You can poke holes in either of those teams. You can talk about how Phoenix, apart from Chris Paul, does not really have guys that have been there, that have postseason experience. It's like Chris Paul and Jay Crowder and not a whole lot else. And then you can talk about how Utah just doesn't have late game closers. They're going to be counting on Donovan Mitchell and Mike Conley to be running the offense, to be creating offense down the stretch of important playoff games. And not that they're not capable, but you would certainly argue that Kawhi specifically, and then to a lesser extent, depending on your opinion of Paul George, that Paul George is better at that. And you would imagine that the Clippers would have an advantage there. And then once you get past the 1 and the 2, there are clear flaws with every other team in the conference. No Jamal Murray there in Denver. Dallas and Portland can't really defend all that well. The Lakers have been beat up all year, and the 8th seed is pretty much irrelevant, as I mentioned, within that context of trying to get to the conference finals. And so you could make the argument that the Clippers should have more confidence this year than ever before. But it doesn't feel like they feel that way, right? This is a team that I thought was going to win the title last year. I actually made a video and picked them to win the title, and then the bubble happened and everything was weird. And I think you could argue that if you're looking for a team that's kind of under the radar, that people aren't really talking about, that should have a really good chance of making the finals, that team is the Clippers. But if they don't believe it and they're actively avoiding teams, then why should I believe it? Granted, someone in the comment section of this video is going to say, this makes sense, this is a smart thing to do. And if Denver or Dallas or a team like that was making a move like this, I wouldn't, quite frankly, I wouldn't judge it so harshly. But specifically for the Clippers, I feel like they're setting themselves up poorly. I feel like they're setting themselves up to fail because it's just a clear lack of confidence. If you really feel like you're an NBA title team, if you really feel like you're the best roster in the entire league, you've got the guys to go out and win a title, it shouldn't matter who you're playing. Correct me if I'm wrong. I cannot recall ever a team actively avoiding a particular matchup in trying to be on the other side of the bracket from another team. Granted, this season has been incredibly strange in the context specifically as it relates to where the Lakers ended up in the playoff seeds. It certainly made this situation possible. Nobody expected the Lakers to be the 7 seed. Even at the time that LeBron and Anthony Davis got hurt, you figured they'd be able to keep it together enough to at least be like a top 5 seed. The fact that they are a 7, they're the defending champs, they're clearly a great team. And I would not be surprised if when the odds come out, they're still the betting favorite to make the NBA Finals out of the Western Conference. But that doesn't change the fact that I think that this is a massive public display of a lack of confidence on the part of the Clippers. And I can't stand by them as a team. Maybe it ends up being a genius decision and the Lakers get eliminated before the conference finals. The Clippers get to the conference finals and they're playing Utah, Phoenix, Portland, Denver, whatever the case may be, and they feel really good about that matchup. And they felt like the one team they couldn't beat, or they had the least likelihood to beat, was the Lakers. And they'd rather avoid them at all costs, let someone else beat them, and then they feel like they can beat every other of the 6 teams left in the postseason on their side, and then they get to the finals. Maybe that's the case, and it works out perfectly for them. But just the way that it looks and the lack of confidence that it displays, for me personally, I can't get past, and I feel like they've jinxed themselves, quite frankly. Let me know down in the comment section below if you guys agree. That is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you guys very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, leave a like rating on it. Check out more videos from me at the boxes on the screen, and you can check me out at various socials in the Linktree link down in the description below as well. With all those things said, hope you guys have an awesome rest of your day, and I will see you all next time.